actually, I have Rosie to thank for introducing me to Charmian, and in both my life and my imagination, because it was actually Rosie who suggested I go to Hydra, and this was in 2014. I had a bunch of little children all about to have their half-term holiday, and that usual thing, I'd finished a book, I hadn't thought really about what to do. We all wanted to go and just sort of get some sun, and Rosie said, go to Hydra, it's fantastic. So we did. And it is a lovely place. And I had no thoughts of writing about it. I don't think I even knew, although I'm a huge Leonard Cohen fan, I think on that occasion, I didn't know that it was the island that Leonard Cohen had made his home. I mean, I knew all of his lyrics, but I didn't know that's where he lived. I think I knew very little about his life, and I knew absolutely nothing about Charmian Clift. And this is Charmian Clift. This is her second memoir that she wrote of a decade that she spent in Greece, in a world pre-mass tourism. It's that picture that first really drew me in. I mean, it is an extraordinary author photograph, really sort of somehow harrowing and yet inviting of, you know, wanting just to know this woman, really. And it's a very odd choice as an author picture. It's a very odd choice as a cover picture for a book. It's kind of intriguing because it looks like she has a black eye. She looks like she's challenging the photographer. The photographer was a very great stills photographer called Liselotte Strello. And I've been unable to find out actually how Liselotte Strello came to take that picture. But Hydra, at that point in 1959, there had been a couple of big films made there, including Sophia Loren's first big Hollywood movie, Boy on a Dolphin. So maybe that is connected to it. Anyway, but it was the writing in this book that hooked me more than anything. She has an incredible way of drawing the reader in. She's a very intimate writer. It's a book about making a go of things with her family. She had two small children. She was married to the Australian writer George Johnston. It's a sort of cast of international extras because a lot of people had started going to Hydra to live cheaply, to make art, to write books. It's a kind of sexed up Durrells with plenty of brilliantly expressed sort of existential angst, and she's got a wicked wit. I mean, she really sort of takes the mickey out of the other people on the island. Anyway, we were there for that week, and then back home with Google, I discovered that her writing career had begun collaboratively with her husband, George Johnston. Now, he had been a famous war reporter in Australia. He was 10 years older than Charmian. And they had written 3 novels together, and she was the less famous half of this writing couple. And that sort of drew me in because I've written collaboratively with my husband. I mean, not novels, but songs. And so I was interested in that dynamic. And so when I looked into it more, actually, what I found was one of the most tragic stories I've ever read. Charmian Clift and George Johnston was dubbed the Ted and Sylvia of Australia. And depending on whose biography you read, fingers were pointed each at the other for being responsible for the early death of the other. It's a terrible story. Second picture. There she is, looking more, I think, like herself. And so that you can see what a strange choice it was to put that picture on the front of her memoir. Here she is. If she was overshadowed in life by the man she married, in death, she was massively eclipsed by her friend on the island, who was Leonard Cohen, who would consign her really to being a footnote in his story. He arrived on the island in 1960. George and Charmian had already been there for 4 years. And he went there to live cheaply and to write his first novel. He had an address that he'd been given to stay at of the artist Gika, who had a grand house on the island in those days. But he was turned away, and I haven't really got time to tell you that story, but it is in my novel, and it's a kind of interesting story. But Charmian and George came to the rescue, as they did with many of the young people who turned up on the island, and they took him in and helped him to find another place. And 2 decades later, when he played his first Australian concert, he dedicated it to the couple who he said had taught him everything he had ever learned about being a writer. And tragically, they had already been dead for a decade by then. So this is a happier picture. This is Charmian, George, Marianne Elon, and Leonard. The child is Jason Johnston, who was born on the island to Charmian and George. He's their third child. And it was really lucky for me that these photographs existed, because it was a gateway to a labyrinth. So what had happened was that in 1960, an old war reporting buddy of George Johnston's had been living in Athens and had been commissioned by Life magazine to do a photo essay of this sort of burgeoning community. And it's the fact that Leonard Cohen is in these photographs that has meant that they are discoverable on the internet. Not all 1,573 of them, I might add, but a few of them, the ones actually with Leonard Cohen in them. It's an extraordinary set of photographs. The essay never appeared, but when I sort of was alerted to them and I had already become very interested in this community, they were an amazing aid to both writing the novel and also researching the novel, because my first job really was to discover who all the people were. So if we have the next picture. So here are a group of this circle of fabled beings at the taverna, where allegedly Leonard Cohen gave his first concert. You can see here we have Klaus, we have Charles Hextall, then Leonard playing the guitar. Next to him is Charmian, George lighting a cigarette. There's Marianne Elon and Axel Jensen, who was soon to be her ex-husband. At the point this photograph is taken, it's a sort of amazing turn of events. He has actually said, "So long, Marianne," and left her for another woman, left her, in fact, with a small baby. But Leonard had just arrived on the island a few months earlier and has kind of taken up his responsibilities while Axel has kind of disappeared, comes and goes. The great thing about being able to identify all of these people is that they all left quite rich archives. And, you know, there are published novels, there are unpublished novels, and they did all write about each other, both on the lines and between the lines. And so for a novelist, it was a very, very rich labyrinth of material. So next picture. Yes, I mean, in that year, 1960, not only had this terrible thing happened between Marianne and Axel, this sort of triangle, and Leonard arriving, but George had just published a novel which exposed Charmian's infidelity. It was kind of non-stop drama. Anyway, here is my novel, A Theatre for Dreamers, out this week in paperback, and Charmian's books. Now, this is a really wonderful thing because Charmian Clift has been out of print in this country for 20 years. And it is extraordinary that a writer of this quality with such amazing things to say, not just about Greece in the pre-mass terrorism era, but also about women's lives generally, that she should be out of print is extraordinary. And it is so wonderful that Muswell Press has put her back into print with these wonderful editions. And you can see here there's also a CD, which is because when I'd finished the novel, David and I, who'd collaborate on songs, were then inspired to write a song. And then I did the audiobook and David wrote some music. And so that's what that's all about. So Mermaid Singing, which you can see there, was her debut book, which was written without George. And it's about their first year in Greece, which was on the island of Kalymnos. which was an island that was going through some very, very interesting times. It was an island that relied on the sponge diving industry, and the sponge diving industry was dying. I will read you a little piece from it because it's the best way to give you a flavour of Charmian. She managed 2 novels in their time, in their decade on Greece, before she returned to Australia and found fame for the remaining 5 years of her tragically short life as a columnist, campaigner and commentator. Anyway, I will read you a little bit because it's quite prophetic, I think. She talked about how George and she could make this work, but she sort of did have a sense of what might happen to her. We are both writers. Indeed, 3 of our novels, including the one we are working on at the time, were written in collaboration. It's the only workable arrangement. But I have a faint, gnawing suspicion that there will come a time when I will somehow find myself several paces in the rear, watching the flick of his keychain and quite unable to catch up because of the weight of the baggage I am carrying. When they went back to Australia, George Johnston was very ill. He had TB. He managed to write 2 novels that both won the Miles Franklin Award. She wrote, amazingly, 240 brilliant essays. She had a powerful progressive voice. She campaigned for the return of democracy to Greece. She was pro-abortion. She was pro-women's rights to birth control, against the lottery barrel conscription and the war in Vietnam. She was a powerful voice, and she had a really, really great readership. So I think it's really lovely to sort of remember her more as this person than the photograph we saw at the beginning. This is her in the early 50s when they did a sort of recce and they went to some Greek islands to look for which would be their paradise. And I will read you one more piece by her, which is from, these are still sadly out of print. These are, there are 4 books of her essays, which you actually can get hold of. And I just like how she writes about, I've got it all out of order. Here we go. She says, "It is the most pretentious nonsense to believe that the work you do will live after you. It might, but then again, it might not. And history will be the judge of that, not you. What most of us leave to posterity are only a few memories of ourselves, really, and possibly a few enemies. A whole human life of struggle, bravery, defeat, triumph, hope, despair might be remembered finally for one drunken escapade." Now, in July 1969, and following a day of drunken rowing with George, Charmian Clift ended her own life by overdosing on his sleeping pills. George Johnston died of TB 1 year later. I am so glad that she is not forgotten. She is such an immersive writer and the best companion anyone could wish for. Do read her and be transported to the Greek islands, away from these times as well as these shores. Thank you.